Let's zoom out now and take this story global. It's just past 6 in Washington, and all eyes are once again turning toward Iran, where unrest inside the country is colliding with rising international tension. Iran's supreme leadership is pointing fingers outward, directly at the United States, blaming foreign interference for the deadly protests shaking the nation. At the same time, President Trump is escalating the rhetoric, telling Politico that Iran may need new leadership. That back and forth is fueling anxiety far beyond Tehran. Joining me now is Associated Press United Nations correspondent Farah Miri, who's been closely tracking how this crisis is playing out behind the scenes at the UN. Far, Iran's leadership is framing these protests as a foreign-backed plot, singling out the U.S. This is a narrative we've seen before. From what you're hearing at the UN, how aggressively is Iran pushing that message internationally? Iran has spent weeks laying the groundwork for this storyline, arguing that what began as economic frustration has somehow morphed into a coordinated foreign operation. And while the protests were initially driven by rising prices, shrinking opportunities, and deep uncertainty facing millions of Iranians, the government is now portraying the unrest as something imposed from the outside. What's really happening is that years of pent-up anger have boiled over. The regime is struggling to contain it, and when that happens, blaming external enemies becomes the default response. It shifts responsibility and tries to rally domestic support, but internationally, that argument is wearing thin. In fact, several regional players have been urging restraint. According to AP reporting, multiple Arab nations quietly reached out to Washington, asking the U.S. not to strike Iran and to allow events to unfold internally. That pressure appears to have influenced the White House's recent decision to tone down its language, at least for now. What's striking is how isolated Iran has become on the global stage. Even when it tries to reframe the narrative, the room isn't buying it. We saw that isolation play out earlier this week during an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Iran's ambassador was there making the case. But behind the official statements, what's actually happening? Is there any serious international investigation into the reported deaths and arrests? That's one of the biggest challenges. Very few international organizations have real access inside Iran, and foreign journalists are largely shut out. That means much of what the world knows comes from UN agencies, human rights groups, and activists on the ground. The UN has been documenting Iran's human rights record for years. Just months ago, it released a report placing Iran among the worst offenders globally, especially during periods of unrest. But verifying numbers, how many people have been killed, how many detained, is incredibly difficult. Even death tolls become contested territory. So while there are international bodies watching closely, the lack of transparency makes accountability an uphill battle. Viewers often see the formal speeches and official cameras at these Security Council meetings. But what's happening when the doors close? What are diplomats saying off camera? That's where the real story often lives. The UN is built on diplomacy, so even bitter adversaries speak quietly behind the scenes. What stood out during this emergency meeting was just how few countries were willing to go to bat for Iran. Aside from Russia, Iran found itself largely alone, even privately. Regional players like Qatar and the UAE are increasingly aligned with the US, positioning themselves as mediators rather than defenders of Tehran. And even longtime partners like China were noticeably cautious. Iran's traditional support network is thinning. Its regional proxies have been weakened, and that loss of leverage is being felt in these closed-door conversations. How are major UN member states interpreting this war of words between Washington and Tehran? A lot has changed recently. After the short but intense conflict involving Israel and Iran, and U.S. strikes on Iranian-linked sites, the regional balance shifted. Alliances are being recalculated in real time. Countries that once leaned heavily toward Iran are now hedging. Sanctions have taken their toll. Military setbacks have exposed vulnerabilities. And internal unrest has made Iran look less stable, not more defiant. Behind the scenes, even Iran's partners recognize that Tehran doesn't have the leverage it once did. That's why moments like the sudden halt in executions, reportedly following conversations involving U.S. officials, are so telling. It suggests pressure is working, even if Tehran won't admit it publicly. who, realistically, is still standing with Iran at the UN. Russia remains its most vocal defender, emphasizing sovereignty and accusing the US of interference. But this time, Moscow was largely alone. China offered only limited cautious support, far from the full-throated backing Iran might have expected in the past. That shift matters. When even your strongest allies hesitate, it signals a loss of influence. Do those allies actually believe Iran's claim that the US is responsible for the bloodshed? Publicly, yes, especially Russia. Their rhetoric consistently frames the US as destabilizing, and President Trump's own comments encouraging protesters have reinforced that perception in their view. But belief and convenience often overlap in diplomacy. What's said publicly doesn't always match what's believed privately. One question we keep getting from viewers: how close are we to US military involvement again? There was definitely a drumbeat toward conflict not long ago. Hawkish voices in Washington were pushing hard. Military assets have been repositioned, but the focus of US power right now appears to be closer to home, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America. Many analysts believe that direct intervention in Iran without a clear plan for what comes next would be deeply risky, not just for the US, but for the entire region, especially at a moment when there's no clear alternative leadership waiting in the wings. Diplomacy may look frozen publicly, but history shows that back-channel talks almost never stop. Exactly. Even when officials say talks are over, communication usually continues at lower levels. We saw that during the conflict with Israel. Negotiations were happening even as public rhetoric suggested otherwise. It's unlikely that top leaders are speaking directly, but envoys and diplomats remain in contact. And as Iran looks to de-escalate pressure at home and abroad, those quiet conversations may matter more than any public statement. Farah Miri, Associated Press UN correspondent, thank you for your insight. And as this situation continues to unfold, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Iran is facing pressure from every direction at once, inside its borders, across the region, and on the global stage. The protests themselves are no longer just about economic hardship. What began as frustration over rising prices and shrinking opportunities has evolved into something far more dangerous for the regime, a direct challenge to its authority. And that's why the leadership in Tehran is leaning so heavily on the foreign interference narrative. When a government can't control the streets, it tries to control the story. But that strategy has limits, especially when images, testimonies, and reports continue to leak out despite restrictions. Each new account undermines Iran's insistence that this is all the work of outside agitators. And each new death or arrest increases the scrutiny from human rights organizations that are already documenting a long record of abuses. At the same time, Washington is walking a careful line. President Trump's rhetoric has fluctuated, at moments sounding confrontational, at others noticeably restrained. That shift isn't accidental. It reflects the reality that any U.S. move toward Iran now carries enormous risk, not just militarily, but diplomatically. Behind closed doors, allies are urging caution. There's widespread concern that direct intervention could backfire, strengthening hardliners in Tehran or plunging the region into deeper instability. With the Middle East already undergoing major realignments, few countries want to open another front without a clear endgame. And then there's the question of leverage. Decades of sanctions have weakened Iran's economy, but they've also hardened internal divisions. The regime is strained, its regional influence diminished, and its list of reliable allies shrinking. Yet desperation can be unpredictable, and that's what keeps diplomats on edge. What's especially striking is how different this moment feels compared to past crises. Iran is no longer commanding the same level of loyalty from partners who once shielded it at the UN. Even those offering support are doing so cautiously, weighing their words and choosing silence more often than solidarity. That silence may be the loudest signal of all. For now, the world is watching closely. The streets of Iran remain tense. The rhetoric between Tehran and Washington remains volatile, and the real decisions, the ones that could shape the region for years, are happening far from cameras and podiums, in private rooms and quiet conversations. This is no longer just a story about protests or politics. It's a test of how power shifts when pressure builds from within, alliances weaken from without, and legitimacy starts to crack. We'll continue tracking every development as it happens. Stay with us.